إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونؤمن به توكل عليه ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له. أما بعد. The tragedy of Karbala, we often speak about it as a once-off incident in our history. But the reality is that Karbala was actually the beginning of a very dark period in our history. It had a ripple effect across the Muslim Ummah, and it led to several other negative events that would take place over the next few years. And this is something that we don't talk about in our community for a number of reasons. Number one, as a community, we don't really study history. This is a major problem, right? History isn't really covered beyond the Seerah and the Khulafa al-Rashidin. And this is, of course, after that time. And that's problematic. We should be familiar with every point in our history, in every era of our history. The other reason why it's not really covered in our communities is that some of our leaders assume that if we talk about these incidents, it may lead to sectarianism, it may lead to doubts about the religion, it may make Islam look bad. And I don't agree with that. I think as a community, we are mature enough that we can discuss our history without having to have negative opinions about the people who came before us, without gaining some sectarianism or doubts about the religion from it. Then we can have mature intellectual discussions about our history and what actually happened. So I just want to mention today I want to talk about what happens after Karbala. Right? That's what today's khutbah is going to be about. What happened after Karbala? And actually, I may have to extend this over 3 or 4 khutbahs, because a lot of things happen after Karbala. Right? And I'm going to do this a bit backwards, in that I'm going to start with the lessons, and then I'm going to go into the historical facts. Normally I narrate the story and then I give the lessons. Today I'm going to give the lessons first, and then we'll begin going into the history, because that history is going to go over a few weeks. Right? The first lesson I want us to take from this period of our history is for us to understand that while our religion is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the people throughout our history are human. You see, many of us have this misunderstanding that, before World War I, it's all awliya and pious people, and, only good things happen. We have this utopia, this myth in our mind. They were just all pious people, and this is, where we take our deen from. And this myth also comes from the idea of what we call Islamic history. This is why when I teach history, I always tell people it's not Islamic history, it's Muslim history. Islamic history is just the prophets and the first generation of the Sahaba. Anything after that is Muslim history, because these are human beings. What you will find with many of these figures that we study is they have both good and bad in them, just like us. Many of us, we have this picture in our mind that we want to box people in history into heroes and villains. But most people in history are not heroes and villains. They're normal people, right? They did good things at one point in their life and bad things at other point in their life. You can't put them into these boxes. History is much more complex, and you'll see this in the stories that we go through, that some of the people who are the heroes at one point in the story, they do bad things at other point in the story, right? Because these are human beings dealing with very challenging times. So we need to avoid this labeling of everyone in history into these boxes of heroes and villains. Another important thing that we need to keep in mind when we study specifically this point in history, the first 100 years, we tend to back project our current worldview and our current landscape of the Muslim world to that era. What do I mean by this? Today we hear a lot of wars going on in the Muslim world between Sunnis and Shia, right? So some people go back and they read Ali versus Muawiyah and Hussein versus Yazid and Zayd ibn Ali versus the Umayyads, and they read it as Sunni versus Shia. This is a misreading of history, because Shiism doesn't exist at this point in our history. Right? These are simply two parts of the Quraysh, the Ahlul Bayt and the Umayyads. They're both part of the Quraysh. These are two tribes from the Quraysh fighting over politics, fighting over power. In reality, both tribes have the same aqidah. Both tribes follow the same Islam. They're not fighting because the other group's a deviant, or the other group has a different aqidah from us, or the other group is preaching a new version of Islam. It's just political. We read into it the sectarianism. But at that time, there's no sectarianism. At that time, it's pure politics. Right? This is our misreading of history, that we go back and we say, oh, this is Shia versus Sunni. It's not Shia versus Sunni. Right? It's Muslim versus Muslim. It's people fighting over power. So this is a misreading of history on our part. Another lesson we can take from all of these events that take place is that there has never been, at any point in our history, a time where everything is perfect and rosy. Because every generation has their ups and downs. Every generation has their times of ease and their times of difficulty. Every generation goes through trials. And this is how our history goes. The time of Abu Bakr and Umar, there is ease. The time of Uthman and Ali, there's trials and tribulations. The time of Muawiyah, there is ease. The time of Yazid and what follows is tribulations. And it goes like this, up and down, up and down, up and down. Every generation goes through their periods of ease and their periods of tribulation. This is life. And this is something that we should find comfort in. Because sometimes we think that we are living in the end times, that we are living in the most difficult of situations, that everyone before us, they lived in the golden age. In reality, the generations before us faced many trials worse than what we face today. Right? We actually should be grateful that we didn't have to live through the Mongol invasion, or the Crusaders invasion of Jerusalem, or what the Reconquista did to Spain. Every generation has their ups and downs, and a lot of bad things happen in our history as well. So let's get into the history of it. Last week we spoke about Karbala, right? We spoke about what happened at Karbala. What many people don't realize is that Karbala sets in motion many events that would change the landscape of the Muslim world in a variety of ways. It is in many ways the catalyst of what happens after it. It's very similar to the murder of Uthman radiallahu anhu, right? These are two events that have a similar and different timeline. They're similar in some ways and different in other ways. Uthman radiallahu anhu, who was an Umayyad Khalifa, he is murdered, and this leads to a civil war between the Umayyads, Muawiyah, and the Ahlul Bayt, Ali, right? One generation later, one of the Ahlul Bayt, Hussein, is murdered, and this leads to a civil war between the Umayyads and other factions. Right? So there's similarities here, but there's also differences. So what happens? Karbala is not something that the Ummah just let go. It wasn't something that the Ummah just let go of. Rather, there were consequences. The first thing that happens after Karbala is Hara, the Battle of Hara. What is the Battle of Hara? Well, essentially the Muslims of Medina would not sit back and do nothing about Karbala. They rebelled against Yazid, and they protested against Yazid, and they said he's not fit to be the Khalifa, and they want a new Khalifa. So Yazid, he tells Ubaidullah ibn Ziyad, the man who murdered Hussein, to go for Medina. Ubaidullah ibn Ziyad, and this shows even the tyrants had some conscience. Ubaidullah ibn Ziyad says, I already have the blood of Ahlul Bayt on my hands. I don't want the blood of the people of Medina on my hands. So he refuses to go. So even he had his limits to his tyranny. He didn't want double the amount of murders on his head. So Yazid, he hires a bunch of mercenaries, a bunch of thugs, led by a man called Muslim ibn Uqba. And this army of Muslim ibn Uqba, they invade Medina and they massacre the Muslims of Medina. One of the worst incidents in our history. In fact, historians point to this incident as the worst thing that Yazid did. Why? Because with Karbala, Yazid didn't tell his commander to do Karbala. But he is guilty because he didn't fire him or punish him for doing it. With the attack of the Holy Lands, the city of Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, the children and the grandchildren of the Sahaba, this was a direct command by Yazid, where he told his army to attack Medina. And he gave them 3 days to do whatever they want to the people of Medina. And I can't even mention the mimbar, what his army did to the people of Medina in those 3 days. Then he tells his army to go to Makkah. So what else happens after Karbala? I already mentioned last week that Abdullah ibn Zubayr, the great Sahabi, whose father and grandfather were from the Ashara Mubashara, Abdullah ibn Zubayr refuses to give bay'ah to Yazid. He takes over Makkah, he establishes it as his own land. When Karbala happens, this is when Abdullah ibn Zubayr says, Yazid's not fit to be the Khalifa, I am the Khalifa. So he declares himself to be the Khalifa. So Yazid now sends Muslim ibn Uqbah and his army after Makkah. And they surround Makkah with catapults. And they bomb Makkah. And they destroy the Kaaba with catapults. Right? All in an attempt to get to Abdullah ibn Zubayr. It is the qadr of Allah that while all of this is going on, Yazid dies. Dies at a young age from some health problem, a heart attack or something. Allah took him before he could do more damage. And everything we just mentioned, Yazid was only the Khalifa for 3 years. All of this mess happens in a 3-year period. Right? All of this mess happens in a 3-year period. But the death of Yazid is not the end of it. Because after he dies, things get more complicated. You see, Muawiyah radiallahu anhu, he had a logic behind what he did. Right? Many people don't agree with it, but there was a logic. His logic was, if I don't choose my successor, there will be a civil war over who is the Khalifa. So he was right in his logic, he was wrong in his choice of successor. He didn't realize his son Yazid was going to be such a tyrant, right? He was wrong in his choice. Now when Yazid dies, what happens? There is a civil war over the Khilafat. Because Yazid chooses his son Muawiyah II to be the Khalifa. But Muawiyah II is also sick and he dies 40 days later. And that's it, that's the end of the line of Muawiyah. Many people think the Umayyads that we know of is the descendants of Muawiyah. They're not. Another plot was coming, right? Muawiyah's dynasty is just 3 people. Muawiyah, Yazid, Muawiyah II. And Muawiyah II, you can't even really count him. He dies 40 days after his father. So Muawiyah II dies. Who's the Khalifa? Abdullah ibn Zubayr has already declared himself the Khalifa in Makkah. Because of Karbala and Harra, the majority of the Muslim world has lost faith in Yazid and his descendants. Right? And by the way, Yazid's son Muawiyah was actually a righteous man. He may, if he was actually had the proper khilafah, maybe he would have turned things around. But with the qadr of Allah, he also died young. So, at this point, the majority of the ummah gives the pledge of allegiance to Abdullah ibn Zubayr. And the majority of the ummah accepts Abdullah ibn Zubayr as the Khalifa of the Muslim world. But, 2 plot twists. In Kufa, there is a group of people feeling guilty about Karbala. So they rise up, they take power, they establish their own Khilafat, and this becomes a separate state. Right? Run by a group of rebels, led by a man called Mukhtar al-Thaqafi. The other plot twist, in Damascus, in Syria, which is the heartland of the Umayyads, the people of that land still want an Umayyad ruler. So Marwan ibn Hakam, he sets himself up to be the Khalifa. Right? In Damascus. Marwan ibn Hakam, he is the cousin of Muawiyah and Usman. So in the Umayyah family, there's 3 branches. Usman, Muawiyah, Marwan. Right? These are 3 branches of the Umayyad family. We have Khalifas from all 3 branches. So he's the cousin of Muawiyah and Usman. He's the eldest of the Umayyads that's still alive. Some people even say he was a Sahabi. I don't agree with that. I think he was from the Tabi'in. But some people say he was a Sahabi. Right? So Marwan ibn Hakam, he's an elderly man at this time. He's the oldest of the Umayyads. He sets himself up as the Khalifa in Damascus. So what happens now? We have 3 people claiming to be the Khalifa at the same time. What do you think is going to happen? Civil war. A civil war worse than the first civil war. Because the first civil war lasted 4 or 5 years. The civil war between Abdullah ibn Zubayr and the Umayyads lasts for 14 years. The next 14 years of our history, Muslims fighting each other over the Khilafat. Anyway, Marwan ibn Hakam doesn't last long. Right? His death is a strange story. So basically, to consolidate power, Marwan ibn Hakam marries the widow of Yazid. He marries the widow of Yazid and tells her, let me be the Khalifa, after me your sons can be the Khalifa. Right? Then when he marries her and he becomes the Khalifa, he changes the law where his sons will be the Khalifa, not her sons. Right? And to make things worse, in front of her sons, to embarrass her family, in front of her sons and the entire court, he jokes about what he and his wife got up to in the bedroom. Very inappropriate things. I can't mention them on the mimbar. The son gets angry, he goes and tells his mother what her husband is saying. That night while he's sleeping, his wife kills him. So he's also the Khalifa for 8 months. Right? Some of the historians say his wife suffocated him with a pillow, others say she stabbed him to death. Either way, she kills him in his sleep. His son Abdul Malik comes into power. And this is where we have to stop for today. Because this is where it gets complicated. Because now over the next 13 years, you have Abdul Malik ibn Marwan fighting Abdullah ibn Zubayr for the Khilafat. But here's the thing. Both of these men did a lot of good for the Ummah. Both of these men, when you analyze their lives outside of the civil war, they're actually heroes of the Ummah. This is where history gets complicated. You can have two people who in of themselves are good people, but when it comes to power, they're going to fight each other. So what we're going to do, inshallah, is next week we'll give the biography of Abdullah ibn Zubayr, specifically about his Khilafat and how it ended. And the week after that, we'll do the biography of Abdul Malik ibn Marwan, and specifically his Khilafat and how it ended. Because Abdullah ibn Zubayr is the last of the Sahaba to serve as Khalifa. And it's a tragedy that many of us don't even know he was the Khalifa. Many of us think there were 4 Sahaba who were Khalifa. There were 7 Sahaba who were Khalifa. Right? So we'll talk about Abdullah ibn Zubayr next week. And inshallah the week after that, we'll talk about Abdul Malik ibn Marwan. And all of this is still the consequences of Karbala. Right? Karbala has a ripple effect for more than 14 years. It's the beginning of a long period of many, many events, many, many negative events that derailed the Ummah for a while. And it's important that we study these and we understand these because this is our history and we must be honest about our history. Wa akhiru da'wana alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Alhamdulillahi wahda wa salatu wa salamu ala man la nabiyya ba'da amma ba'd. Many years ago, maybe 6 or 8 years ago, I was in Mombasa in Kenya, in a masjid giving a lecture after Maghrib about leadership lessons from the lives of the Sahaba. And I brought up the civil war, and I derived some leadership lessons from both Ali and Muawiyah. And after the lecture, one mother approached me, looking a bit upset, and she told me, "Why did you mention the civil war?" I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "I don't want my children to know these things ever happened. Why did you mention the civil war in a public lecture? Our children don't need to know the Sahaba fought each other. They don't need to know these civil wars happened." And I explained to her. I explained to her that it's not good or healthy to hide our history from our children. This will not have a positive impact on them. Because when you hide something, it shows that you don't understand it and you can't explain it properly. And not just that, but they will hear about it from other sources, especially in the age of the internet. And they may hear about it from people with ulterior motives. Somebody who's trying to pull them into a different sect, somebody who's trying to make them doubt Islam, somebody who's trying to make them leave Islam, may bring up these incidents and exaggerate about them and give some wrong details about them. And because they don't know the true story, they're going to end up getting caught up in this trap. Therefore, what is the main reason why I wish to bring up these topics and talk about them? So that the younger generation know their actual history. So we don't fall for the traps of the propaganda that's out there. You know, one of the good and bad things about our honesty, right? About us is our honesty. As an ummah, we are an honest ummah. And our historians were honest. This is why when you read history books in some other nations, a lot of times it's full of fairy tales. It's full of myths. It's full of whitewashing, right? When you read our history books, it's full of the bare facts. It's full of facts that are, sometimes we don't like them, but they're the facts. The historians of the Muslim world recorded things as they were, without sugarcoating it. And so, this is how we need to teach it as well. So, my final lesson for today is that as educators, as parents, as community leaders, we need to revive the study of history. And we need to be honest about our history. And we need to have frank discussions about our history. And we need to make sure the next generation know their history. And we shouldn't be shy of specific events in our history. We shouldn't overlook entire periods in our history. We should rather have discussions about them, because this is all a part of what made the Muslim world what it is. As you will see in the coming weeks, Abdul Malik ibn Marwan is the one who establishes the civilization of Islam. All of these negative events, but eventually it ends with a man literally making Muslims into a superpower. So everything connects together, and you can't have missing pieces to the puzzle. You have to talk about the good and the bad to understand our history. And so, inshallah, we will continue next week when we look at the biography of Abdullah ibn Zubayr, and the week after that with the biography of Abdul Malik ibn Marwan. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give us the correct understanding of our religion, and to allow us to understand and take lessons from history, and to make us from the righteous. رَبَّنَا آتِنَا فِي الدُّنْيَا حَسَنَةً وَفِي الْآخِرَةِ حَسَنَةً وَقِنَا عَذَابَ النَّارِ وَآخِرُ دَعْوَانَا الْحَمْدُ لِلَّهِ رَبِّ الْعَالَمِينَ. أقم الصلاة.